required to pay attention to this behemoth of a storm system as it moves into the central eastern plains and as well as the Ohio Valley. None of those locations will be safe from severe weather as it approaches into the region by tonight, into tomorrow, and the next day. This is going to be a dangerous situation that is going to unfold for many of us. In some way or another. Of course, it is just a risk, so I'm not saying that you are going to experience dangerous severe weather if you live in those areas. However, there is that possibility, and you have to be aware of that possibility as we move into today, tomorrow, and even the next day, Wednesday. All throughout, I will be here guiding you throughout this severe weather event as it intensifies into what we see here. So, what exactly is happening? What exactly are the dynamics that are causing this to happen? Well, let's look. And let's look at the upper air dynamics. I'm just trying to get them. 500 millibar height and wind. So, you can see above your head, far above all of your bodies, you can see that there is some very strong winds in the higher atmosphere right now, and a little bit into later. Over here in Arizona and New Mexico is where they're the biggest. So, one thing to note with this is where these high winds end in the upper atmosphere, where they all congeal into lower winds, is where we're likely going to see severe weather. Because basically, as these winds dissipate and die out into smaller winds, they are more likely to move in all different directions. They're likely to move far up into the air and come back down in the form of hail. They're likely to move into storm clouds and be exerted out of outflow boundaries, which will cause the wind. And some of them are able to rotate and spin into possible tornadoes. So that is what we're looking at. And you can clearly see where these winds end is where we're going to see severe weather. And this is able to have a great impact on what our forecast is. Today, our severe weather is in two locations. One, there is actually an area in eastern Virginia into southern Maryland and southeastern Delaware. And this will cause some severe weather, but it's not tornado. It's not based on tornado potential, which is something we should be thankful for, but rather it is based on the winds and the hail. And there is actually a small area in southern Indiana, as well as western Kentucky, that will also have the potential for hail, larger hail, in fact, than this region. However, the area in Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware is still under an enhanced risk, which is something to be aware about due to the winds. So still realize that severe weather is likely in those regions, but what we're really seeing for the tornado potential, as well as the wind and the hail, is over here in the plains, Kansas, Nebraska, into South Dakota. This is driven by a 10% tornado risk. And you can see those dashed lining that is within the 10% means that strong tornadoes are possible. They have the ability to be EF2 rated or stronger. And around this, we have a 5% area that moves all the way down into Texas, which is a little less likely for tornadoes to happen. However, it's still a possibility. Wind. We have this area in Virginia, but we also have this area in Kansas and Nebraska with 30% wind values. So there's going to be some strong winds at that edge of the boundary where the outflow boundary will set up, which is what the edge of that, edge of those winds sometimes is called. Sometimes an outflow boundary can form from those winds. So it's a little different, but as long as you understand the general gist of it. Then hail. We have a hatched risk for these locations, as well as in Kentucky and Indiana, which means that large hail is possible, up to 1.75 inch in diameter or more. And that will be another concern. So be careful with leaving your pets outside if you live in Kansas, Nebraska, and even into South Dakota. I will admit, South Dakota is maybe getting on some of the action too in the far southern regions. So be careful up there too. Be aware in all these regions. But we're not done. Of course, then we have another enhanced risk tomorrow in Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. This is an enhanced risk driven by 10% tornadoes, entirely hatched, which basically means that these tornadoes can be strong in Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois. And this will include the city of Des Moines. It will also include Davenport, some of those locations where millions of people live. So you do have to be alert for possible changing weather conditions and a very small possibility of a tornado. However, it's not zero, so you have to be aware. 5% risk moving down into Arkansas and towards eastern Illinois as well. Wind. Now, the wind isn't as high of a risk as it was the previous day, but you can see we still have a 15% chance for severe winds, which is modest, but definitely not the strongest that we'll see. And hail, once again, is likely the main threat with the system. And this will be for Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois, and a hatched risk around that area, including that area as well, which will encompass some of Kansas and Nebraska, some extreme eastern portions of those states. And we're still not done. The next day, we have a slight risk for southern Indiana, western Ohio, and central and western Kentucky, and a little bit of southeastern Illinois. This isn't able to show us what the exact parameters for this are yet, but we will be able to notice them soon as we move into tomorrow. So, once again, I already showed you these winds. I already showed you the winds that are very strong as they move into Kansas, into 8Z, into that general region. And I've already shown you how strong and their influence they can be. And this will continue until the next risk. For the next day, you can see as the outflow boundary or the eventual outflow boundary will likely set up, and the edge of these strong winds will set up over Iowa, which is where the main severe weather will be. And especially you can see that as we go into later in the day, where now it's beginning to set up over Illinois, and that is where the risk will continue. So clearly you can see what exactly this height of the wind is doing. But what about lower in the atmosphere? Lower in the atmosphere, here, if it's in that area where severe weather will be possible, then the winds have to be strong. The winds have to be strong in that exact area, because the winds will decrease in height as they move to the edge of that higher wind values. So, you can see we have some strong winds in the lower atmosphere which quickly strengthen as we move into later in the night. And that will continue to grow and become very strong, up to 60 knots, which is around 70 miles per hour over Nebraska, Kansas, and other areas. Of course, we can also see this on the other models. We can also be aware. We have to check all the models to make sure that they're agreeing, and yes, they are agreeing that there's going to be some strong winds, which will spark the potential for tornadoes and other severe weather. Now, looking at some of the other parameters, you also have some other severe weather parameters besides those winds. You have the Cape, and the Cape is pretty strong. Over here in Oklahoma and Kansas, you can see a significant amount of Cape there. And that is not even the main area of Cape. The main area of Cape would be the mixed layer Cape, which is all of the layers of Cape, in all layers of the atmosphere. And you can see there's a lot of that. There is a lot of that, up to 3,000 2,000 joules per kilogram, which, just to say, is a lot, as it enters into southwestern Kansas, into central Nebraska. And this is late in the night. Realize it's late in the night, which means the parameters for these tornadoes to develop will be in the night, which is dangerous because you won't be able to see them. You may be able to hear them, which is absolutely horrifying to some people, but you might not be able to see them. And you'll be sleeping by then. So just be aware, keep a weather radio in your area if you live in these areas, and just be weather aware. Of course, you don't have to be scared. Don't be scared. All you have to be is aware. And as these systems continue to move into the Iowa, Missouri, and Illinois region, we have some CAPE too, some mixed layer CAPE, and some most unstable CAPE too, which will be present within these areas with up to 2,000 joules per kilogram in this region. Of course, we have even more. We have storm relative helicity, and that is definitely here in these regions, up to 200 values, and that will cause some tornado potential. And, of course, back in the plains, you can see some as well. Over here in Oklahoma and Texas, too, there's a lot of ingredients there, even not in that 10-hatched area. And also, they're in Nebraska in the 10-hatched area. And then after that, we have the significant tornado composite, which is where the significant tornadoes may develop. You can see they're mainly here over Texas and Oklahoma. I will point out that a lot of these ingredients will actually be a little bit more south than what is anticipated. So we do have to watch out even if you live in Texas and Oklahoma. I do think there is a possibility for storms there. We already have a tornado watch in effect in western and central Texas. So who knows? We'll see what happens with that. But, of course, it continues and persists into Kansas and Nebraska. So, what exactly is this going to cause? We know exactly what is causing this, but what is this going to cause? Let's look at the reflectivity. So, if we start now, we see that nothing is really happening. However, those ingredients will quickly cause stuff to develop. And this stuff will be dangerous to those that are caught off guard. Of course, you can't see them quite yet by the 23Z area, which is around 7 p.m. local time or 8 p.m. local time. However, you can see a few storms begin to develop in South Dakota first and later congeal into a line as they move into northern areas of South Dakota. Those are not the main storms. These are completely separate storms, but they do have a small potential for tornadoes still, even though they're not quite the main threat. So we continue to wait, and one thing about the HRRR, it really doesn't fire too many storms. It really should be firing more storms. If we look at the NAM, you can see there is much more storms in those regions. Wrong model. It's the NAM 3 kilometer. There we go. You can see there are so many more storms in Nebraska and Kansas in this region than in the HRRR. So you do have to compare the models sometimes. I do think this scenario is more likely, and of course, there could be some more storms in Texas. Let's not forget. Earlier in the day, likely, which of course will have less of that nocturnal tornado threat. But you can see there's so many storms beginning to fire, and they're all isolated, which means they have the potential, a higher potential for tornadoes as they move throughout Kansas and Nebraska. And this is going to cause severe weather of other kinds too, hail and wind. And we continue to move, and eventually these congeal into a full line of storms, which is less able to produce tornadoes, but still can cause severe weather in terms of hail and wind. And you can see as this moves to Iowa, there is a small tornado threat with some of these storms that form behind the rainy area of the line, and those have a tornado threat, but they're still not our main storms. More storms form behind those, and you can see them as we move into around the 18Z area, which is around 2 p.m. in this local region, 3 p.m. maybe. So you can see there is a little bit spurts forming on the backside of these, and eventually these will form into storms. You can see a cluster of supercells which are isolated in nature over here in Des Moines area, down into Missouri towards Kearney, and you can see that these may be able to produce tornadoes as well as they move into the Quincy area of Illinois. And that is where our risk for tomorrow is. So that is something to note. And of course, the HRRR shows this too. You gotta compare the models because you gotta make sure that they're trustworthy. You can see that there are some storms there too, a little less, which of course is what the HRRR is portraying with this event, but still storms nevertheless. And as we go all the way out into the next day, you can see some storms are here, and there is a blank area where more storms will be able to develop. And you can clearly see what those storms are on the NAM 3 kilometer. And those will eventually congeal into supercells, possibly more supercells in the Indianapolis region, down south into Kentucky. This is a little farther out, so we can't trust this completely. But you can see some isolated storms exist. So, this is an event that will impact millions of people. But, as long as you're prepared for it, and as long as you make sure to stay safe, you'll be fine. So, it's not like death is on your doorstep with this event. It isn't. Don't think that. But, you still have to be aware. Because if you aren't, it might change your life. Anyways, guys, thank you for watching. Please make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications. If you don't know what the notifications look like, it's the bell icon right next to the subscribe button. And also make sure to like this video. I don't care if you dislike. If you really didn't like this video, fine, dislike. But it's complicated to choose the road you want to go on. But realize the best road of them all is the Morris Data on the Road freeway. Goodbye, guys.